Well, good afternoon, everybody. I was made sure I got here in time to go over to the Monument Inn. You got the pan-fried shrimp. That's a routine here. And there were dolphins in the middle of Lynch's Ferry. So that was kind of a nice show this morning. So I'm going to take that as a good omen. So what I'm going to talk about today is why San Jacinto changed the world. Now I know we have a strong contingent from the Alamo. Yeah, and I remember the Alamo. I've done some work down at the Alamo. But in terms of the way we see ourselves as Texans, the Alamo is the undisputed champ. But in terms of the most important battle from the Texas Revolution, San Jacinto by far leaves the Alamo in the shadow. So it takes both of those to get your whole Texan on. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about San Jacinto and, some what ifs and what happened and what might have been. So let's go ahead and review on what exactly happened. Don't you love PowerPoints where it's nothing but big bulleted lists? Well, this is one of them. So Mexico starts life as a republic in a remarkably good position in terms of natural resources, the availability of capitalizing on mineral wealth. It was really poised to be a major power in 1800 while still part of the Spanish Empire. But by 1821, it was wrecked. The Mexican War for Independence had been absolutely destructive, and it killed hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people. The most productive silver mine on planet Earth was in northwestern Mexico, and it was flooded and would never be unflooded. They couldn't recover it anymore. So much of the things that showed so much promise about Mexico in 1800 were absolutely off the table by the time it becomes a republic. So, where do you go from there? The other thing that happens with Mexico by the time it becomes a republic is they can't quite figure out what kind of nation it's going to be. But they did figure out that they were going to need some help to recover from the disaster of their war for independence. Now, just for a second, let's consider the difference between the Mexican War for Independence and the American War for Independence. American War for Independence was about a suite of ideals. We hold these truths to be self-evident. And people are fighting for this idea, and after a while they begin to rally around this suite of ideas. When you get to the Mexican War for Independence, it starts with a pretty simple idea. Anybody know what the big takeaway is from the Grito de Dolores? It's not something we talk about much in Texas schools, but we oughta. The big takeaway from that was death to bad government. Well, okay, I guess we can get behind that. Bad government needs to go. But as the war progressed, nobody could gain the upper hand in the war for Mexican independence. Until finally you had this coalition of former royalists and insurgents that bring about the independence of Mexico. So what are they fighting for? Well, it kind of depends on who you're asking. And there is no big declaration of who we are as a nation. And as a result, Mexico starts its existence as a republic kind of schizophrenic. They can't quite figure out what kind of nation they had formed, although they had formed something that was different than the Spanish Empire. So the first players in, the Federalists, believed in a decentralized government with a lot of autonomy in the various regions because Mexico is vast and the best decisions are local decisions. Opposing that are the Centralists, who are really kind of closet royalists, who really think that, the best government is the one that rules with an iron fist. And both of these are in play in Mexico. Well, the Federalists are first up to bat, and they say, look, we would really like some help in turning some of our far reaches in el norte into productive territories. And Stephen F. Austin says, absolutely, I'm in. I'm going to help you build out your commerce and your agriculture. This is actually what he wrote to the jefe político in Tejas. And if you wonder if Stephen F. Austin was not an enthusiastic Mexican, then you haven't read his mail. He's looking at this great Mexican experiment as being one of the most remarkable things going on the planet in the 1820s. That doesn't get a lot of play in the discussion either. But, as we know, things go sideways in the 1830s. So how do we get from Stephen F. Austin being an enthusiastic immigrant to what he thinks is going to be one of the most dynamic nations on earth to all of a sudden becoming an advocate for a split with Mexico in the end? Well, the story about why the American settlers that came to Texas rebelled against the Centralists who swept into power, threw the Federalists out, started a cycle of civil wars that seemed to be interminable. The story of why the Texians, the American Tejanos, rebelled is pretty well known. And I use the term American Tejano on purpose. See, everybody that lived in Tejas was a Tejano because it's a location. If you live in California, you're a Californio. If you live in Zacatecas, you're a Zacatecan. This whole Anglo-Tejano thing is actually a later creation in the 1960s and 70s. So when you read Dead People's Mail from the 1830s, they're all talking about themselves as Tejanos. And as you saw from Austin's letter, he considered himself a Mexican Tejano. So you've got to be very careful with your wording when you're talking about the populations here. So you'll hear me say American Tejano from time to time, and that might be a head scratcher. But essentially we're talking about points of origin, not necessarily some sort of ethnic designation that's a later manufacture. All right. So we know the story of the Texas Revolution. You've heard it before. You've read about it. You've seen it on exhibit in museums like here at the Alamo. The museum that's going to open there in 2028 is going to be mind-blowing. In fact, everybody probably needs to wear a helmet when they go to that museum to keep their brains inside their skull. It is pretty remarkable. So let's just take a look at this as a real estate problem. So here's the United States in 1836. You notice it's kind of got a weird, funky shape to it. And I'm not entirely sure that it knows where its Pacific boundary is in 1836. That'll come about from a little bit of a tug of war with Great Britain. So there is this very Atlantic orientation to the United States. Everybody's looking east in 1836 because the West is just a big question mark. Well, because of the Texian revolt and because of what occurs actually here on this ground, this will become the shape of things to come. This is the state of Texas outlined lightly, but you can also see the ghostly image of the old Republic of Texas claims. A lot of people don't realize that the Republic of Texas, during its 9-year existence, actually at one time claimed the Pacific Ocean as its western boundary. You know, they were very ambitious for a nation of 40,000 people. But I would like to point out that this included really good skiing. And last week I was diving in, actually I guess it was this week, I was diving in Cozumel, which was actually also claimed by the Republic of Texas. So somehow by the time we got to this year, we gave up all the good recreation sites. Lost all of our skiing, lost all the good diving, oh well. But we did keep some other stuff that I'll talk about here shortly. So the independence of Texas and then annexation to the United States leads to the U.S. war with Mexico. U.S. war with Mexico leads to the Mexican cession, which now shows a much greater bite taken out of the Mexican nation. So Mexico is reduced by half during this 20-year episode. Lots of territory lost. Now, we could have a very spirited conversation about whether or not Mexico actually exercised full authority over that territory. But just in terms of who's got title to it, they lose a big chunk of their country. The United States gains, Mexico loses. And the United States begins its rise as a world power. What's that mean in practical terms? Well, gold, ports on the Pacific, and oil. Some of the largest petroleum reserves on Earth were underneath that ground that was seeded. Gold was discovered just at the end of the U.S. war with Mexico. That gold flowed into American hands and not Mexican hands. The greatest port on the Pacific, San Francisco, was in American hands, not Mexican hands. All of these advantages flowed to the United States because of what happened on the very ground where you're standing or seated now. All right. Till you get to today, and the United States becomes a Pacific power. There's a reason that we have so many aircraft carrier combat groups. We project power on two oceans. We are involved in the Pacific in a very large way. We become a global power because of these things that happened at this place on April 21st, 1836. So what did San Jacinto do to Mexico? The story of what it did to the United States is a pretty easy one to lay out. I did skip one minor detail called the United States Civil War, which was caused because of the Mexican cession and the question of whether or not slavery could be contained and on and on. But this is not a Civil War lecture. We could go on for a long time with that discussion. But here's the net effect for Mexico. As I alluded to earlier, Mexico was in a spiral of non-stop civil wars, coup and counter-coup. A lot of times people say, well, you know, Mexico had it all going on in 1829. They absolutely abolished slavery. Well, actually, Vicente Guerrero issued what essentially was a presidential proclamation doing away with slavery, but it was never ratified by the government. So it'd be like, I don't know, say a current president of the United States issuing an executive order that didn't quite have any legs outside of his office. So that is complicating things on exactly what kind of nation Mexico is. They can't agree on what kind of nation Mexico is. So they're always fighting kind of off balance with all of these foreign interventions. One of the most fascinating places I've been is a museum in Mexico City called El Museo de los Intervenciones. It's in the old convent of Churubusco. And it says, the thesis essentially at this museum is, Mexico would have been just fine if people would just quit messing with it. The French, the Spanish, the Norte Americanos. Heck, we can throw Comanches in on there too. That's their thesis. There is this sense of, we had things figured out, people just kept messing with us. Well, maybe. I mean, I take a pretty good sized grain of salt with that, because Mexico's government was so chaotic. In many ways, it was leaning towards becoming a failed state. Think of, say, Somalia or Lebanon. So, the defeat on April 21st, here on these grounds, began a long process of Mexican soul searching. Why can't we seem to get this sorted out? Why can't we pull this off? We have everything in our favor, yet we can't coalesce as a nation. Why is that? And that question will start to influence what had been evolving into just strongman politics, caudilloism. Now there's actually people in Mexico saying, what is inherently wrong with the way we're going about this? You know, if we keep trying the same thing over and over again and keep coming up with the same results, we may be crazy. So how do we get uncrazy? All right. This smoldering conversation and the ongoing constitutional crisis between Centralist and Federalist ultimately leads to the rise of a new kind of Mexican politician, Benito Juarez. And Benito Juarez says, you know, part of our problem, as he's diagnosing Mexico's failings, is that we don't really rally around ideas. We rally around personalities. And we've got to get away from personality cults and get into principles. So he launches into La Guerra de la Reforma. Mexico also has a civil war as a result of San Jacinto. But it's tough to tell them apart by that point. By 1853, the nature of their civil war starts to really form up. You know what also happens that same year is the Gadsden Purchase. That's a little piece of American history that we mostly overlook because we're leading our students right into the Civil War in the next chapter. Well, the Gadsden Purchase was a big deal in Mexico because we paid a lot of money, the United States, to Mexico for that strip of Tucson, about the size of Tennessee with Tucson in the middle. Where'd that money go? Went into strong men's pockets and not to the betterment of the nation. And that triggered Juarez to say, nah, we can't do this anymore. This is just not going to work. Well, Juarez finally gets the nation sorted and gets the nation sorted even against a French intervention. And finally, Mexico's on an even keel, but ultimately the answer is Porfirio Diaz. And Porfirio Diaz says, now we have answered all these constitutional questions, and I am the answer. The problem is, it kind of was lapsing back to strongman government. And then when people had had enough, an otra revolución in 1910. And by and large, because of his connections to the United States and European powers. So Mexico in 1824 looks pretty robust. Pretty robust. Let me get my little pointer. There's the occupied island of Cozumel, just in case you're trying to place it on a map. Looks really nicely spread out, robust, and think about what's going to come out of here, what's going to come out of here. Mexico was set until it wasn't. And all that ground is lost. So what did not happen? What if Mexico, what if Santa Anna had won the Battle of San Jacinto? How would things have been different? Well, I'm pretty sure Sam Houston would have danced at the end of a rope or been shot. Because I think that the options for the Battle of San Jacinto were win or die. I don't think there was a lot of way to escape it. So think of all these people that are celebrated at this site as being just more anonymous dead people thrown on the brush piles in answer to the Tornell Decree, including Sam Houston. Well, that's kind of an alternative history. But I don't think that would have ended it. My take on what Santa Anna's goals were in the Texas Revolution was to ethnically cleanse Texas, to reverse about a decade and a half of immigration, legal and illegal, that Mexico had lost track of because Mexico was distracted by never-ending cycles of political chaos. So he said, you know what, we need to hit the reset button. The runaway scrape is about driving everybody out of here. The idea that Santa Anna is a great emancipator, well, he's a great emancipator in the same way that Sherman was a great emancipator in Georgia. You remove slaves from the plantations because they are elements of military aid and comfort to the enemy. I don't think that was part of his great goal in the campaign. It was get rid of anything that smells of gringo. All right. So that happens, but, you know, Texas is a big place. You know, I was just up in the Pecan Point settlements last summer, and you forget that Bowie County, stuck up there in northeast Texas, is part of this whole drama. But, man, that's a long way from where we're standing. And in order to control East Texas, you would have had to have militarized Texas in a way that Mexico could not have pulled off. Not at first. There'd have been a simmering civil war here. A guerrilla war. And Santa Anna would not have been humiliated. In fact, he would have emerged stronger than ever, which would have had great implications for the nation. Caudillos would have faded in the face of the age of Santa Anna. Federalism and liberalism, which finally became the answer with Juarez, would have never had the oxygen to live in the age of Santa Anna. There would have been no catalyst for change. The answer that they would have left with was, we are awesome, just the way we are. No need to change. So, longer term consequences. Gold rush still happens. Perhaps Mexico benefits, or perhaps Santa Anna benefits. And based on his later track record with the Gadsden Purchase, I think he'd have been happy to have all the gold from Sutter's Mill. Great Britain probably would have supported Mexico. One of the things that they were keenly interested in was the port of San Francisco, or the San Francisco Bay. There was no port of San Francisco at the time. And the Californios were in constant conversation with the British, not really trusting that Mexico was ever going to effectively occupy California. So either California would have seceded and become a British protectorate, or in this scenario, Great Britain would have said, we need to make Mexico into a client state so that we can have that port on the Pacific. The United States doesn't end. It just becomes a great Atlantic power and more closely intertwined with European affairs. Mexico, maybe, just maybe, might have become a great Pacific power, but they'd have had to get a lot of things right. So this is kind of what the map of North America might have looked like under that scenario. Yeah, we still got Oregon, our little outlet to the sea, but really our orientation is toward the Atlantic. Which means, guess who would keep open the Straits of Hormuz instead? Mexico.